I wonder how you respond when someone threatens you or attacks you. I struggled to keep my cool recently when I was confronted after sitting in the wrong chair in a retirement home and I got threatened with the committee. I got defensive, but I managed not to go on the attack. She had a Zimmer frame. Do you tend to overreact when someone has a go at you? Are you made of easily flammable material? Our series so far has talked about the importance of materials being durable and unbreakable. We want stuff to last. But it's also key that stuff is non-flammable. And there's a good reason why. There are laws regulating the flammability of sleepwear, dressing up costumes, furnishings, and cladding on buildings. What a thing is made of matters most when the heat rises and the sparks fly. Will the material withstand the heat? Or will it go up in flames? Sadly, we often only find out what something's made of once the smoke has cleared. When the heat rises in your home or workplace, when you come under fire or the sparks fly, do you manage to stay cool and calm? Are you made of non-flammable material that enables you to be resilient and rise above it? Or do you use these emojis a lot? Maybe you're feeling hot under the collar right now after a stressful day, or you know you've got a short fuse, especially if someone is turning the heat up on you. We're following the story of Daniel, who lived 600 years before Jesus. If you've missed it, you can catch up on fbcnext.com. Daniel lived in a different age, but we can relate to the pressure cooker environment that he found himself in. And all of us, whether we're in church for the first time or we've been following Jesus for years, can learn something from his story. Forcibly deported from Jerusalem, Daniel and his friends were more than 1,600 miles from home, serving the Babylonian king. They took only what they could carry, plus their faith in God. Instead of resisting and plotting revenge, they cooperated in the situation they believed God had placed them. Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were appointed officials over the Babylon district. And it was here that King Nebuchadnezzar set up an enormous image of gold, probably wood overlaid with gold, but still an impressive 90 feet high. Local leaders were ordered to fall down and worship the image whenever they heard music. Anyone refusing would immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. It was draconian. I guess it was a golden image of the king himself. No one dared object, no one demonstrated for religious freedom, no one questioned the new law. And when the music played, the people bowed down. But then accusations were brought to the king, probably by those who were jealous of the Jews. There are some Jews whom you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image you set up. The accusers also helpfully reminded the king of the death penalty that he'd imposed. Well, the first accusation wasn't true because the three men had served the king well. As for the rest, well, they hadn't publicly refused to obey, they hadn't lodged a formal protest or encouraged others to rebel, but simply quietly refrained from taking part and carried on with their work. Their actions weren't public, but neither were they hidden. So they must have known they risked discovery. But why did they draw the line here? Why was this issue so important when they'd assimilated into the Babylonian culture in so many ways? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were confident in their identity as God's people, despite their immersion in a foreign culture. And God, through Moses, had given his people 10 commandments, key to following him. Firstly, you shall have no other gods before me. Secondly, you shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. The three men were loyal to the king and served him well, but they couldn't worship this image in good conscience. It would be idolatry. They would worship only the one true God. Well, the king was furious and he summoned the three men. To his credit, Nebuchadnezzar wanted to check the facts and not accept hearsay. Is it true? If you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you don't worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? The king believes he's the ultimate power. Well, the heat really was rising here. This was an even greater test for Shadrach and co. It's one thing to make a quiet stand for God. It's harder to stick to your guns when challenged about it, and the threat was real. They could easily justify compromising on this relatively small thing. A toe can bow and they'd be good to go. They're just fitting in with the locals. They're not being called to publicly re-announce their allegiance to God. They'd be able to do more good in their positions of authority if they lived. And yet, the three men replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." Yes, they do. If they want to live, they need to mention their years of hard work and loyal service. They could have called in witnesses, maybe Daniel, to give evidence about their good character and loyalty to the king. They could have argued the unreasonableness of the law. But I guess they had disobeyed the king's command. Technically, they are guilty. There's enormous pressure on the three Jews to compromise here. The king's fury, the heat coming from the nearby furnace, the music, horrified colleagues, gloating accusers. What were they thinking? As young men, they'd witnessed the destruction of their city, the plundering of their temple. God hadn't shown up to rescue them when Jerusalem was under siege, and they'd been deported from the land he'd promised them. So I would get it if they were feeling a bit wobbly in their faith and asking God some serious questions. Why have you allowed this? Are the Babylonian gods more powerful? Have you forgotten the promises you made or lost your power? Or worse, don't you care? They risked everything here, their job, their position, their life, to stand up for a God who so far had not intervened to change their circumstances, to enable them to go home. But God had prepared them for this. In Chris's talk, we heard God had blessed their obedience when they chose to eat simpler food and thrived, a personal spiritual discipline that grew their faith. In Paul's talk, we heard how God had answered their group prayer when Daniel was under pressure to interpret a dream. They were in a small group that grew their faith, intentional community. And they had previous experience of actively trusting God and stepping out when facing similar difficulties. This gave them confidence and courage to obey God now. But their confidence in God didn't mean that they fought back in anger, nor did they threaten the king with God's judgment. What did they say? If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand. They're risking their lives to follow God. They're confident that he's powerful and able to intervene somehow to rescue them from death. But they don't have a plan. Looking around, there was nothing they could see to back that up. No fire retardant suits or fire extinguisher, no shining angels, and not even Daniel, their friend, putting in a good word for them. But they chose to believe it. So was this just stupidity, blind faith that had no basis? Would their faith fall apart if God didn't intervene with a miracle? They continued, "But even if he does not rescue us, we won't serve your gods or worship the image of gold." Even if God didn't show up this time, they would still obey and accept what comes. Their confidence in the face of threats and power was astonishing and infuriating for the king. They were confident in their identity as the people of God, confident in his promises and love for them, so confident that they were willing to submit to God's will for them. They didn't doubt God could rescue them, but neither did they presume to know God's will. They recognized that God's plan might be different from their desires. So they stood by their convictions boldly and they calmly explained their reasons. What courage! They disobeyed this one law, but they still showed respect. They didn't disparage or publicly criticize the king, but neither did they shrink from proclaiming truth to him. even though they knew it wouldn't go down well. They didn't complain about their human rights or the unfairness of the situation. I would have done. They made a stand and they left their fate in God's hands. They were non-flammable in their response. I wonder if this non-flammable response reminds you of anyone. Someone who was unfairly accused of rebelling against the state, of inciting others, someone who'd selflessly, generously served others their whole life, but was threatened with immediate, painful execution. Someone who didn't threaten or fight back, didn't jump to defend themselves, who trusted God unswervingly, who had complete confidence in his power. Someone who was willing to submit to God's will for them, wherever it led, whatever it cost. Centuries after Daniel's friends, Jesus, in his last hours during his trials before the religious and political authorities, quietly spoke the truth. He didn't back down, but he didn't argue or fight. He trusted in his Father's plan, trusted that God would vindicate him. Jesus prayed earnestly to be delivered from the cross, but God had a greater plan. So Jesus accepted the immediate consequence of his obedience, his own death. In the face of accusation and threat, he showed total faithfulness to his Father, obedience to God's plan for him, and confidence that he was doing the right thing. In the same way, Shadrach and Co. were faithful to God, obedient to his command, and quietly confident in their response. If they were calling the king's bluff, they failed. Nebuchadnezzar went up in smoke. He really was flammable. Furiously, he ordered the men bound and the furnace superheated. It was horrific. Perhaps it wasn't too late to obey the king. It might save them even then. But their courage didn't fail. They waited until the flames were so fierce that soldiers died throwing them into the furnace. There was no chance of survival, but at least it would be quick. The king watched the whole thing. He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Unbelievable. No screams. It's as if the flames, the heat, weren't there. But there's a 4th figure. Was he shining somehow brighter than the flames? Who was that 4th figure in the fire? An angel sent by God? Most probably it was Jesus himself, God's Son, God himself, in human form, present with them in the furnace. Complete divine presence and protection. But we don't know if the 3 men could see that 4th person with them. Sometimes in the furnace, we're aware of God's presence, and sometimes we're not. He is with us either way. Sometimes God delivers us from a difficult situation. Other times, he miraculously sustains and strengthens us through that trial. Nebuchadnezzar had said, "What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Now he shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out." Only the true, ultimate God wields real power over the natural world that he created. Everyone crowded round, incredulous. The fire hadn't touched them. Their clothes were intact. Eyebrows weren't singed. There wasn't even the smell of smoke. But the ropes that had bound them were gone. Can you imagine the silence, the amazement? The 3 men said nothing. They didn't need to. The king finally spoke. "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." Nebuchadnezzar has discovered a lot about this God. He sent a rescuer. He's incomparably powerful, worthy of trust, and deserving of complete obedience. Well, what did the 3 friends do? They went back to work. They've shown themselves to be resilient, non-flammable in more ways than one. But I bet they were pumped. Imagine when they got home and their wives asked how their day at the office went. had a bit of trouble with the boss, but God got it sorted. It's a different age. But I think we can all learn from their example, whether we follow Jesus or not. Their example of what to do when we come under fire, when someone has a go at us in the workplace, or things heat up at home, or we feel threatened. We can be so quick to get defensive and ramp up the heat by making accusations of our own, and that just stokes the fire. Or we can follow Shadrach and Co.'s example by being non-flammable, keeping calm, listening, acknowledging where we're at fault, if we are, and finding a way forward together. You're right, I didn't put the bins out. You're right, I didn't get that project finished on time. We don't need to point out our accuser's failings. We always have that option of staying calm, not jumping to our own defence, not counterattacking or making retaliatory threats. When you come under fire this week, will you choose attack, defence, or stay calm? But I think there's a specific application for followers of Jesus too here. When we come under fire for our Christian beliefs or practices, or the church comes under fire. It hurts when we're mocked for our faith or feel we're discriminated against. You might face opposition for offering to pray for a patient or colleague, or face criticism for answering questions about your faith or values, or encounter extra scrutiny when applying to foster or volunteer or work in some environments, or even face dismissal and rejection in the workplace. So how should we respond then as Christians? Should we go up in flames by making threats? Should we get aggressive because we know they're wrong, or react defensively, pointing out our rights and the unreasonable stance they're taking, decrying our godless nation? If you and I follow the example of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and more importantly, the example of Jesus, we should expect differences with today's society, because we're called to live counterculturally. We're called to be non-flammable, to respond with grace, explaining our views gently and trusting God to vindicate us instead of jumping to our own defence. If we stand for Him and speak truth with gentleness, then we can be sure He's on the case. He has our backs. The 3 Jewish friends were vindicated dramatically and in plain view. Their prayers were answered and they lived through the fire. But it doesn't always end that way. Despite his distressed prayers, Jesus had to experience suffering and a shameful, painful death, and then wait before his heavenly Father vindicated him with resurrection life. And that's the sobering reality for many Christians facing persecution today around the world. They won't see justice done in this life. Vindication will only come beyond death. When you and I come under fire for following Jesus, then we can trust Him to vindicate us in His timing. But please note, this only works if the opposition we face results from our obedience to God. God isn't going to vindicate us when we've behaved badly. But we may need to accept the immediate consequences of our obedience to God. That might include a cold shoulder from a friend, criticism, verbal or online abuse, our business being ostracized, or disciplinary action or dismissal. And that injustice is painful. It may feel like being thrown into the blazing furnace. Shadrach and Co. accepted the consequences of their civil disobedience. They didn't try to escape it. Jesus accepted the people's rejection and didn't resist the cross. I wonder if the stuff you are made of is non-flammable, resilient. The secret to being non-flammable is trusting God to vindicate us, not leaping to our own defense, accepting the immediate consequences of our obedience, even when it's not fair. If every Jesus follower did this, if the church stayed non-flammable when it comes under fire, while the heat rises in our nation and the sparks fly in our community, what would people say as they look at the people at the church? I think they would see the presence and power of the living God walking among us, like that fourth person walking in the furnace. They would look and wonder, why don't they go up in flames? Why are they resilient, still there, still believing, still trusting, still serving the community, non-flammable? Because the Most High God is walking among them, even in the furnace. May God enable you to be non-flammable this week, and may you know His presence with you in the furnace.